It is a great pleasure to host this public lecture on economic growth, energy, and sustainable development. Thank you very much, Lord Stern, being here with us here today. Y lo que les quisiera yo decir es que al final de la plática va a haber tiempo para preguntas y respuestas, y lo que sí les voy a pedir es que al rato les van a pasar unas hojitas. Si las pueden llenar en inglés bien, si no, no se preocupen, las ponen en español y nosotros las traducimos. Entonces, muchísimas gracias. Santiago, por favor.
Muy buenos días a todos. Muy buenos días, doctor Rogosinski. Muy buenos días, Lord Stern. On behalf of the Ministry of Energy and the Sustainability Fund, it's great to have you here, Lord Stern. We really want to thank Nacional Financiera and Dr. Rogosinski for hosting this event. Thank you so much for all of your support. For the Ministry of Energy, NAFIN has been and has always been a great partner. We have a lot of projects that we have been working on together, and they are really important for the energy transition of Mexico. As you all know, we are currently in the middle of an energy reform, one of the greatest energy reforms that Mexico has had for the past 70 years. And it's important to mention that many of the things that we have done so far have been done thanks to the support of NAFIN. You might have heard of some of the programs, such as the exchange program for refrigerators and air conditioning systems that has been done through NAFIN. We have Ecocrédito Empresarial, a program that is supporting SMEs, and it's extremely important for exchanging inefficient technologies for efficient ones. And we are working on a cities program in order to come up with more than 320 projects in order to bring an energy transition to cities, in a few words. So that's something really important to mention and recognize, that we are doing that, and Mexico is doing that thanks to the support of NAFIN. I just want to say a few words. Humankind faces an extremely complex set of challenges in the 21st century. Climate stabilization, energy security, sustainable land use, and equitable development. If some 9 billion people are to live a decent life on our crowded planet, we will require, above all else, a steady and affordable supply of fresh water, food, fibers, and fuel, the natural capital that forms the basis for a continuous generation of wealth. Yet, we are unlikely to achieve global sustainability without a great transformation, making all facets of society more respectful of the existing planetary boundaries. From a book that Lord Stern wrote, they finish with a referral back to Bertrand Russell and Albert Einstein, who, towards the end of their manifesto, they observed that what perhaps impedes understanding of the situation more than anything else is that the term mankind feels vague and abstract. People scarcely realize in imagination that the danger is to themselves and their children and their grandchildren, and not only to a dimly apprehended humanity. These sage words are valid back and then perhaps more valid today. We dearly hope that this meeting with Professor Stern actually helps us to encourage all of us to look at humankind and climate change within the energy sector. Lord Stern is a British economist and an academic. He is Patel Professor of Economics and Government, Chair of the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics, and Professor of Collège de France. Since 2013, he has been President of the British Academy. Professor Stern earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in mathematics at Peterhouse, Cambridge, and his Doctor of Philosophy degree in economics at Nuffield College, Oxford, with a thesis titled Location and the Rate of Development, a study in the theory of optimal planning. He was a lecturer at the University of Oxford from 1970 to 1977 and served as professor of economics at the University of Warwick from 1978 to 1987. He taught from 1986 to 1993 at the London School of Economics, became the Sir John Hicks Professor of Economics. From 1994 until 1999, he was the chief economist and special counselor to the president of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. His research focused on economic development and growth, and he also wrote books on Kenya and the Green Revolution in India. Since 1999, he's a member of the International Advisory Council of the Center for Social and Economic Research, and from 1999 until 2000, Stern was chairman of the consultancy London Economics, founded by John Kay. From 2000 to 2003, he was the chief economist and senior vice president of the World Bank. In 2003, Stern was recruited by Gordon Brown, the Chancellor of the SQR, to work for the British government, where he became second permanent secretary at Her Majesty's Treasury and head of the Government Economic Service. Having also been Director of Policy and Research for the Commission for Africa, he was in July 2005 appointed to conduct reviews on the economics of climate change and also of development, which led to the publication of the Stern Review. The Stern Review report on the economics of climate change was produced by a team led by Stern at Her Majesty's Treasury and was released in October 2006. In June 2007, Stern became the first holder of the Patel Chair at the London School of Economics. In 2008, he was also appointed chair of the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment, a major new research center also at LSE. He is chair of the Center for Climate Change Economics and Policy at Leeds University and LSE. Stern was elected a Fellow of the British Academy in 1993. He is also an honorary Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a foreign honorary member of the American Economic Association. In the 2004 Queen's Birthday Honors, he was made a Knight Bachelor for services to economics. In May 2014, Stern was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in recognition of his work challenging the world view on economics of climate change. With that, it's a great pleasure to welcome you, Lord Stern. Thank you, Dr. Rogozinski, for hosting us again.
Thank you both for that very kind introduction. And thank you to the Sustainable Energy Fund for the invitation to be here today. And thank you to Nafin for being the host. It's a great pleasure to be with you. Thank you all very much for coming. I want to speak today about the strategies, how we approach, how we think about economic growth, sustainable development, and energy. So I'll be covering a very broad field. Much will depend in practice on the specifics of policies, the specifics of implementation. But I'm going to stay at a fairly high strategic level to ask the questions, what should we be trying to do? How should we be understanding these problems? I hope in the interchange we'll be able to spend some time picking up questions of detail and more direct aspects of implementation to the extent that you're interested in some specific areas, and I'm happy to try to do that. I also want to recognize the great striking leadership that Mexico has given the world, the first country outside the developed countries to have a specific legal structure with targets, and that's fundamental leadership, and we can see in the policies that have been developed over the last few years, the energy strategy and so on, some very strong leadership putting that 2012 legislation into practice. But I'll be speaking not so much about Mexico, but about overall world strategy for tackling growth, sustainable development, and energy. So the question is, how do we put growth and poverty reduction objectives together with rising demand for energy and the desire, the wish, the duty to be sustainable? We have to, of course, start with an understanding of what we mean by sustainable and where that obligation or duty comes from. And that's where I'll begin the discussion. So, first slide, please. Next slide. So what I have falls into four parts. Four parts are first to get a clear understanding of what we mean by the problem of combining growth, sustainable development, climate change, and bringing in energy. Then I will say something about a report which was released in September this year by a commission which was chaired by Felipe Calderon, the former president, of course, of Mexico, which I had the privilege of being co-chair, and I chaired the Economic Advisory Panel for that commission. And that looks specifically at the challenge of better growth, better climate. And I'll explain what we did what we were trying to do in that context. And then the last two parts of what I have to say will be looking at specific topics, big topics, but specific topics within that overall framework. How do we think about equity? How do we think in particular about equitable access to sustainable development? That was the language of COP16 in Cancun. And how do we integrate those ideas of equity into the challenge of getting an international agreement and the road from Lima to Paris? I will be going to Lima tonight to participate in the discussions that are taking place there. And in COP20, the last COP before the COP21 in Paris at the end of next year, when we try to put an international agreement together. And so I will look specifically at equity, then I'll look specifically at energy systems, both of those things in the context of how we manage to combine growth, poverty reduction, sustainable development in the context of climate change. So next slide, please. We have to start then, if we're talking about sustainability, we have to start with an understanding of what sustainability means. I think at least in the economics of development, we have a fairly stable definition now of what sustainability means. It's a word that's used very generally, and it sometimes means different things to different people, but the formality, I think, is fairly stable now in the context, at least, of economic development. And so what we mean by sustainability is that the next generation has the same opportunities as we are. The opportunity to do no worse than ourselves, ideally the opportunity to do better than ourselves, assuming, of course, they behave in a similar way for the next generation. Of course, the generation following us would have the opportunity might have the opportunity to do just as well as ourselves, but only by leaving the generation after them very badly off. So we have to send that one through over time. So the basic idea of sustainability is that every generation leaves the next generation chances at least as good as themselves, with the proviso that they behave in the same way to the subsequent generation. So that's the idea of sustainability. It does not mean leaving things exactly the same, because all sorts of things will change, including ideas and technology and capital and so on. But it does mean that what we leave the next generation gives, in all its various dimensions, all the capitals of various kinds have to be of a kind that will leave them with that opportunity to do no worse than ourselves, ideally to do better. And that's a statement which you can articulate if you want to chase it deeper into its foundations in moral philosophy. You can speak about common rights, that we and the people who follow us are people on equal standing. The fact that someone is born later than I am doesn't make that person any different in terms of the rights that that person has. The date of birth is some accident of history. We wouldn't want to discriminate between people simply on the date of birth. So the idea of sustainability comes from or can come from, some notion of common rights to development, some notion of equality as human beings. So that's the foundation, if you like, in terms of a rights-based view of moral philosophy for the idea of sustainability. There are other ways that you can introduce the idea of sustainability. You can relate it to Aristotelian ideas of virtue in behavior and what makes a good person. A good person, in the Aristotelian sense, could well be a person who makes sure that the people who come after them have at least the chances that they had. They're not, that it is not virtuous, as it were, to undermine the chances of people who follow you simply to gain something extra for yourself. Now, there are other ways too, but what I wanted to emphasize is that if we argue that it's important that we have a sustainable approach to development, we ought to think about what the foundations in ethics and moral philosophy is, or what constitutes those foundations in ethics and moral philosophy. So that's the definition. I'll take that definition as guiding what comes. But immediately when you make a definition like that, you ask what determines the opportunities for people who follow us. What does determine the opportunities? Well, it's the capital that they have. But with a very broad notion of what capital means. It's not a very elegant language, but we often use in economics the language of human capital. The educations, the capabilities, the health that people have. That determines what they can do. That's, in a sense, their capital. The environment, the ecosystems are part of a system of natural capital. The way in which people talk often about social capital, the way in which people interact as communities. You can move forward, you can accumulate capital, and you accumulate physical capital. If at the same time you undermine the coherence of a community, you actually are undermining something important about what the next generation has. And of course, our culture is a big part of our capital as well. So when I say that sustainability means, or if you want to understand whether or not we have acted in a sustainable way, you would look at all the various forms of capital that this generation leaves for, or creates for, or contributes to the next generation. So that definition of sustainability takes you straight to the examination of capital in all its various forms for the next generation. So that's the idea. The next slide, please. So there are many threats to sustainability, but the one I want to focus on, and perhaps the biggest one for our generation, is the threat associated with climate change. I won't develop that in great detail. I'll move through this fairly quickly. But basically, if we take as the point of departure or the base for comparison the middle of the 19th century, we've been accumulating greenhouse gases since that time as a result of growth based on hydrocarbon energy. And of course, the destruction of forests and some aspects of grasslands as well. So the result is that we are now at something like 445 parts per million concentrations of greenhouse gases, looking at CO2 plus the other Kyoto gases. That's up from around 280 in the 19th century. We're adding about 2.5 parts per million to those concentrations each year, and that rate of addition each year is rising. If we did not do very much, before long it would be 3 and more. So if we looked 100 years ahead and suppose that we did not do much about climate change, that 445 parts per million might be around 750 parts per million. That's if we did not change our ways. That kind of concentration of greenhouse gases could lead to temperature increases relative to the 19th century of around 4 degrees centigrade. Might be more, might be less, but roughly around that level 100 or so years from now. We can't tell whether that would be 100 or 120 or 130. We can't tell whether it would be exactly 4 degrees, but those are the kinds of risks that we run if we do not tackle the problem of climate change. Now, if we have the next slide, please. We have to understand just how big 4 degrees centigrade is. We have not been at 4 degrees centigrade for tens of millions of years. We haven't been at 3 degrees centigrade for perhaps 3 million years. We as Homo sapiens have been here for perhaps 250,000 years. And basically, our current civilizations date from the Holocene period, the period after the last ice age, which unwound around 10,000 years ago. So our civilizations, perhaps 10,000 years from going backwards, started to develop. As Homo sapiens, 250,000 years. We're talking about temperatures we haven't seen for tens of millions of years. And that could happen very rapidly in a period of 100 years or so. Those risks are enormous. It's difficult to be specific about exactly what will happen where. We cannot be sure. But it would be likely that some parts would be deserts. Perhaps much of southern Europe would look like the Sahara Desert. Other areas will be underwater. Other areas will be hit by very severe weather events, extreme weather events like hurricanes and so on, which of course in this part of the world you are very familiar with. Well, we are at only 0.8 degrees centigrade. We are seeing the effects of climate change, but we're seeing the effects of climate change, which is serious from the point of view of what we've experienced in the Holocene period. We're right at the edge of the temperatures that we've experienced in the last 10,000 years, but we're thinking or trying to imagine temperatures way outside that range. And it seems likely that the geography would be transformed. The reasons we live where we live, rivers, ports, seashores, weather, those are the reasons we have chosen historically to live where we live. Those would be rewritten. Hundreds of millions, perhaps billions, would have to move. If you see population movement on that scale and that rapidity, you're likely to see conflict. And it's the reasons for the conflict, the reasons for the movement of people would not be reasons that you could just switch off. You can't just make a peace treaty with the laws of physics and hope that they reverse themselves. If you're stuck with those very high concentrations in the atmosphere, you're stuck with them for a very long time. So it's very important at the beginning, I won't dwell on this anymore, but it's important at the beginning to realize the stakes that we're playing for. They are immense stakes. We are gambling, and what we're trying to do is to reduce the risks which we face. This is a story of the management of risks, and of course from the point of view of sustainability, if we see change of that kind, then it would undermine all the progress in development that we've made. So that's the story of the risks that we are playing for. So next slide, please. Now, just a moment to reflect on the equity side of that. It's the poor people in this story, and we've seen it, of course, from weather disasters. It's the poor people who are hit earliest and hardest. We are all at risk, but we have to recognize that the impacts of this kind of change are very inequitable. They hit poor people earliest and hardest. So the challenge then is to find ways of growing, overcoming poverty, which do not carry that kind of risk. If we don't do that, we risk undermining all the advances that we have made. Next slide, please. So basically, this is the end of the first part of what I have to say. We have, in my view, two defining challenges of this century: overcoming poverty on the one hand and managing climate change on the other. Clearly, from what I've already said, if we fail to manage climate change, we will create poverty, will reverse the gains we have made. If, on the other hand, we try to manage climate change by putting blocks on the reduction of poverty in the next 20 or 30 years, we will not be able to create the coalitions that we need to manage climate change. So that's why I say if we fail on one, we fail on the other. So it's crucial that we're able to find an answer to this question: how do we grow and overcome poverty whilst at the same time managing climate change? Well, I think very strongly, and of course I'm not alone in this, that we can in fact do exactly that. We can do that, but we have to do that. We have to find a way of overcoming poverty and managing climate change at the same time, because if we don't, we will fail on both. So that's the end of the first part of what I want to say. So let me turn to the story of, next slide please, of better growth and better climate. Better growth and better climate is the title of the report of the Global Commission on Economy and Climate, the new, sometimes called New Climate Economy, chaired by Professor Calderon, which I mentioned at the beginning. I will go into a little bit of detail on that. I haven't got time for very much, but let's begin by looking at the scale of what we had to do. I said we have to drastically reduce emissions to avoid the risks of climate change. How much do we, next slide please, how much do we actually have to do that? Well, we are currently, as a world, emitting around 50, the numbers matter here, I'm not going to emphasize many, but I will emphasize these numbers. We are, as a world, emitting about 50 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. That's CO2 plus the other greenhouse gases measured in terms of CO2. We're emitting as a world about 50 billion tons a year. To give ourselves a reasonable chance, even just a 50-50 chance of holding to 2 degrees centigrade, we are going to have to reduce in the next 15 years that 50 to something like 35. And by 2050, we're going to have to reduce those emissions to something under 20. Now, you can always do a bit more now and a bit less later, or a bit less now and a bit more later. So these are rough descriptions of the path. You could have a target of around 40 billion tons in 2030, but if you did, you'd have to do rather more later, and you'd have to bring down emissions faster. But basically, we have to start very soon bringing down that 50 billion tons of CO2 equivalent, and we have to bring it down a long way. We have to, by 2050, get it down to something like 20. And that is obviously a very radical reduction. And it does mean that we have to be close to zero total emissions by the end of the century. Electricity will be a very important part of that process. It will determine a lot of what you can do in other parts of the economy. So we have to be aiming for something like zero emissions from electricity by the middle of this century. Next slide, please. If you think of what that means in relation to emissions per unit of output, if the economy grows, if the world economy grows by something like 3% over this next 35 years or so to the middle of the century, it would multiply by a factor of around 3. So we've got to get 50 down to 20 between now and 2050. That's dividing by 2.5. If the overall output in the world goes up by a factor of 3, we have to divide emissions per unit of output by a factor of 7.5, or somewhere between 7 and 8. That means going zero carbon wherever we can, because there'll be some places, like agriculture, where it's not so easy to go completely to zero. So this is the story then of decarbonization, virtually decarbonizing the world's economy by the middle of the century and going pretty well to zero by the end of the century. That is a story of really radical change. So it's very important to be clear about the scale of change that we have to make. Many people say, yes, 2 degrees is a sensible target. Above 2 degrees, the scientists tell us rightly that this is dangerous, but you have to, at the same time, recognize the scale of emissions reductions that are necessary if that is the target, and it should be the target we have, and it is the target that we have, the 2-degree target, as agreed in Cancun in 2010 at COP16 here in Mexico. So I think that kind of radicalness of change, going from where we are now to something like a zero-carbon economy at the end of this century, is something that is very radical, and we have to be clear about that, and that's why I sometimes, and other people, call it a new energy industrial revolution. Next slide, please. But if we think now in terms of industrial revolutions, they bring great creativity, innovation, change, investment, and growth. This is a very stylized view of industrial revolutions since the 19th century. The characterization here is the characterization of Chris Freeman, the famous economic historian of technology. There are other ways of doing it, but if you think of two industrial revolutions or two major waves of technological change in the 19th century, in the 18th century, if you think of the waves of technological change starting in the middle of the 19th century with the mechanization of textiles, and then steam and railways, and then steel and electricity and so on, and then oil and automobiles, mass production in the early part of the 20th century. And of course, we have still very much with us the information and communications technology revolution. We've got biotech as well going on at the same time. But those periods are periods of radical change, but they're periods of creativity, innovation, investment, growth. So the fact that I've emphasized the radicalness of the change shouldn't mean that it's a story of no growth. Quite the opposite. During these periods, you get innovation, creativity, and growth. Next slide, please. So that's the background of this report, Better Growth, Better Climate, chaired by Felipe Calderon. Now, that was directed to economic decision makers. It's very important because so much of discussion in this area goes on between, and this week and next week in Lima, the discussions will be conducted largely by environment ministers. Very noble, sensible people. But environment ministers don't run economies. Economic ministers, prime ministers, presidents run economies. Investors, the big investors in the big firms, big private sector firms, they make the big economic decisions that determine what happens to economies. So we have to be able to tell this story, which I've emphasized, of growth and climate responsibility coming together. We have to tell it in a way that's convincing to those who take the economic decisions. So that's why we put the Calderon Commission together in the way that we did. We had 1/3 of it ex-finance ministers, ex-prime ministers, ex-presidents. We wanted ex-finance ministers, ex-prime ministers, ex-presidents, because we didn't want people negotiating, taking positions on behalf of their country. The next third were people who were at the head of very big corporations, from Unilever to Vattenfall to Bank of America, different kinds of private sector institutions. And then the other third were mostly people who were at the head of, or number two, in big international financial institutions. Angel Gurria, whom you all know very well, as former finance minister here in Mexico, head of OECD. He was one example of the people from the international financial institutions, and we had two mayors as well. So it was a story of growth, and to see how we can grow and be climate responsible, directed at economic decision makers. And we set that story, and this is a fundamental part of our analysis, we set that story in the context of the great structural transformations that are taking place in this world. We know that the balance of output is moving very much away from developed countries. 25 years ago, developed countries were responsible for 2/3 of world output. Now it's about half. 25 years from now, it'll probably be about 1/3 from what we call developed countries. That's radical change. We're seeing remarkable urbanization. It's already been moving very fast. It's going to move very fast in the next 25 years, including here in Mexico, probably in the next 15 or 20 years, perhaps more than 30 million people moving into cities. Of course, much more than that in countries like India, China, and much of Africa. We're seeing incomes go through a period where the demand for energy is high. We're going to see a lot of investment and the creation, really, of energy systems in many countries. We're seeing great pressure on land and forests. This is a period of radical structural transformation. So we set the story of the transition to the low-carbon economy in the context of the radical structural transformations which were or which are taking place. Those structural transformations are going to take place. Those cities are going to be built. Those energy systems are going to be created. The pressure on land is going to be resolved one way or the other. We can do it well or we can do it badly. So the basic theme of this report was, if we manage this structural transformation well in the next 15 or 20 years, we will do much of what we need to do to reduce emissions. This is the sense in which better growth and better climate come together. The rate of growth from different strategies of high and low carbon over the next 20 years may not look very different. I don't think that moving to low carbon is a reduction in growth crudely measured. It may be a bit more, it may be a bit less. The crucial point is that not only will there be strong growth, it will be better growth. Cleaner, quieter, safer, more biodiverse, more secure, more community-oriented. It'll be growth which is probably just as fast using crude measures like GDP, but unambiguously better along the dimensions that I've described. So this story of radical change is not just a story of innovation and creativity driving growth. It's also a better kind of growth. So that's the idea. Next slide, please. Managing the structural transformation well, that means relative to congestion, pollution, resource efficiency, land use, and so on. And the major conclusion of the report is if we do that, we'll have achieved most of what's necessary for the low-carbon transition in the next 15 years. There'll be much more of the low-carbon transition to do throughout the rest of the century. But if we manage the next 15 or 20 years well, we will have laid the foundation for that accelerated and still more rapid change that needs to come later in this century. And further, that those investments in managing the structural transformation well will be investments which are directly in the national interest of the country making them. So it'll be, if you like to express it in that way, in the country's self-interest to make a good part of these investments. Not all the investments that are necessary for the low-carbon transition, but the majority which are necessary. If you look at how much we invest around the world in infrastructure, it's about $6 trillion a year. So we will be investing $90 trillion a year in the infrastructure. Just to think a little bit about scale here, Mexico's GDP would be a bit over $1 trillion, just a comparison. The world will be investing over the next 15 years at around $6 trillion a year in infrastructure. And the key question is, do we do that well or do we do that badly? And that's exactly the question which, of course, you're asking yourself in Mexico right now. Next slide, please. What drives this story that much of what we need to do, if done well, will be in the national interest, will be socially profitable, economically profitable investment? The first is the very rapid fall in the cost of renewables. When we published the Stern Review about 8 years ago now, the cost of a solar PV panel was 5 or 10 times as high as it is now. We've seen 80 or 90% reductions. It's quite extraordinary. This is expressed in terms of the price of solar electricity, which is now competitive with standard grid-delivered electricity in many parts of the world. Not everywhere, but in many parts of the world. Next slide, please. And here is something which really came out to us very strongly in doing the Calderon Better Growth, Better Climate review. The PM 2.5 is the very small particulates. The very small particulates, PM 2.5, come from burning, largely from burning coal and diesel. They are enormously prevalent in the world, and we've come to realize through satellite observation in the last 3 or 4 years just how prevalent they are. I've lived and worked in India for 40 years. I've lived and worked in China for 25 years. We're familiar now with the pictures of the smogs in Beijing. The smog that you can see is very damaging, but much more damaging is the smog that you can't see, the PM 2.5s. And you know, the structure of your breathing doesn't filter it out, it coats your lungs. And we're seeing from the satellite observation just how pervasive that is. And we're seeing from work from the World Health Organization just how damaging and costly that is. Now, in China, those estimates suggest that if you look at the premature deaths, if you look at the standard ways in which you might evaluate those deaths, you would find costs for China of upwards of 10% of GDP per annum, and Germany for around 6% of GDP per annum. These are very big, enormous costs, and this is changing the debate. It's changed the debate in China, it's changing the debate in many parts of the world, and this is quite recent information. It is just quite extraordinary, the human costs and, of course, economic costs of the air pollution that comes from burning the hydrocarbons, particularly coal and diesel. Next slide, please. So let me move on quickly now to the notion of equitable access to sustainable development, and I'll link that to the Lima-Paris discussions designed to get an agreement in Paris at the end of next year. So, next slide, please. I've already emphasized that poor people get hit earliest and hardest as the result of climate change. But what about the equity associated with the origins of the greenhouse gases? Well, currently, the developed countries are about 1 billion in 7 billion people in the world. If you look backwards, because of their higher growth, these developed countries, largely dependent on hydrocarbons, they're responsible, that 1 billion in the 7 billion, for around half of emissions looking backwards. And of course, it's the overall concentrations, the accumulation of emissions in the atmosphere that determine the degree of global warming and climate change. So looking back, the rich countries bear a big responsibility for the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But looking forward, the developing countries, outside the developed countries, are now responsible for 2/3 of emissions. We are not going to be able to cut emissions unless all the countries are involved, the developing emerging market countries and the developed or rich countries. It simply won't be possible to bring them down unless all are involved. Now, that's a crucial statement. You can't just wait for the rich countries to do it and then follow on with the others, because the others are such a big part of current emissions now. And for largely good reasons. The reasons that the emerging market developing countries are emitting more is largely because with the hydrocarbon-based activity that we have, their activity has gone up and they have been reducing their poverty. So that's a byproduct, as it were, given the techniques that we've used up to now, the high carbon techniques of rising living standards. So that's not something that we should regret, those higher standards of living, but what we have to do is recognize the importance now of breaking away from the hydrocarbons. So in the future, the big majority of emissions will come outside the developed countries, but we have to remember that the per capita emissions of the poorer countries are still much less than those of rich countries. Depending where you look, third or half or even less than a third. Where do we need to go? Well, we need to go, I've already argued, by the middle of this century, 2050, we need to go to about 20 gigatons, 20 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. 20 billion tons. There will be 9 or 10 billion people. So if the total is 20 billion that we have to aim for, and there are 9 or 10 billion people in the middle of this century, that's just taking the UN forecast. It'll move up from about 7 billion to 9 or 10 in the next 35 years. We have a story of, well, the arithmetic follows that 20 divided by 9 or 10 is around 2. We have to be around 2 tons per capita. Now, United States is around 20 or a bit more tons per capita. Most of Europe is 10 or 11, 12 tons per capita CO2 equivalent. Mexico, around the world average income, around the world average emissions, CO2 equivalent in Mexico, probably around 7 tons per capita. We all have to get down to around 2. That's a measure of the radical change which we have to make. And it's clear in this story that ethics are fundamental. It's the poor who are hit earliest and hardest by the impacts of climate change, and it's the richer people who are still emitting much more per capita than the poorer people. So if we're to get together and collaborate in this emissions reductions, there has to be a notion of equity and how we handled equity built into this story. Next slide, please. Now, I haven't got much time to develop this, but what I want to emphasize is that the language which was introduced in Cancun in 2010 and built into the Cancun Agreement of equitable access to sustainable development is the right way to look at it. It recognizes an equal right to development, an equal right to find for everybody ways of increasing their standard of living, and it recognizes an obligation of sustainability to offer that same right to people who follow after us. So it carries the right language in terms of the common rights of people now and people who come. But it's also a dynamic language. It's development. It's the story of rising living standards. It's not a static language of dividing up a given pie. And often, when you hear the discussion of equity, it gets locked into that static notion of dividing up a given pie, or taking the emissions reductions that need to be done and just slicing them up across countries. We do need to get those emissions reductions done, but we're trying to set it in a context which is dynamic, that's development, which is sustainable, which gives equal rights to people who come after us, and is equitable, taking into account the differential impacts and the differential origins of greenhouse gases, which I've described. It's the right kind of language. It's much more likely to lead to a dynamic approach to the challenge of tackling climate change and to a collaborative approach. Up to now, we've got locked in to negotiations which are a bit like arm wrestling, which is just looking at the emissions reductions and asking who does what, without setting it in the context of equitable access to sustainable development. So I think it's a very valuable language. One thing I'm going to argue when I get to, and have argued already, but when I get to Lima, is that if we keep that at the center of our thoughts, that Cancun language, we're much more likely to find an agreement which is ambitious in terms of emissions reductions, dynamic in its view of development, and collaborative in terms of the way we work with each other. Next slide, please. I haven't got time to go into the details of what might be involved there, but it does involve some shared understanding, the shared 2 degrees goals, and the shared understanding of the risks, but also the shared understanding of the great opportunities that lie in the low-carbon transition. It does mean that we have to accelerate the shift away from fossil fuels, especially coal, which is the biggest villain of the piece here. It means that we, as rich and poorer countries and middle-income countries have to collaborate on innovation and technology, and very important, we have to see how we can bring strong flows of finance to these big infrastructure and other investments I've described. Bringing down the cost of finance, sharing technology will be a crucial part of our understanding of equity and equitable access to sustainable development. Next slide, please. So we have to move away from this rather narrow view that we had before with the Kyoto model, which was largely about burden sharing. This is about equitable access to sustainable development. It's about taking opportunities, development opportunities together, and those who are more privileged with higher incomes being very active in the flows of finance and in technology to make that a big opportunity which is available to everybody. What we're going to see in Lima, I hope, in this coming week, is an agreement that sees the obligations that each individual country takes as enforceable and obligations which are enforced within the country. The Kyoto structure, which tried to enforce obligations by international sanctions, is not going to work, and it hasn't worked. The sanction was that if in this period you did not do what you promised, then in the next period you would have to do more. Well, Canada didn't do what it promised. If it stayed in Kyoto in the next period, it would have to do more. So what did it do? It left Kyoto. That's not the kind of international sanction that's credible. We have to build systems where the enforceability is domestic. Now, in China, the 5-year plans are legal entities. They are not only legal entities, they're the criteria by which the performance of the Chinese leadership is judged. In the European Union, we have specific mechanisms where we are obliged to deliver as members of the European Union on the emissions reductions that are promised. The United States has the Environmental Protection Agency. There are a number, you here in Mexico have been pioneering a legal structure from 2012. So we will be looking, and this is the idea in Lima, at obligations which come forward, and we already have the United States, China, and the European Union who've come forward with their plans up to 2030, and the rest of them will be coming in the spring. So this is an idea of domestically described obligations enforced domestically. But we have to be able to look at what people do, to measure what people do. We have to do it in a collective way. We have to bring an obligation to be examined by others in terms of what we do. And those will be the kinds of obligations that will be part of the agreement. So it's a different kind of structure from Kyoto, but it's one that's much more likely to bring collaboration, and it's more likely to bring ambition. Because if you felt that international sanctions were a reality, international sanctions for not doing what you promised to do, you might promise to do less to avoid the international sanctions. So this is a story which is likely to build ambition. But, next slide please. And it's a big but. The emissions plans that are coming in, and we've already seen half of the world's emissions through the obligations or intended reductions from United States, China, Europe. That covers about half the emissions of the world. We're already seeing that the plans that are coming in fall a long way short in 2030 of what is needed for 2 degrees centigrade. So we have to build into these mechanisms methods by which the ambitions for emissions reductions are increased over time. So not only do we have to be dynamic from the point of view of development and growth, we have to be dynamic from the point of view of revising upwards the ambitions for emissions reductions. That will be built into the framework which I hope is agreed in Lima next week, and which will be made more specific, and the numbers will go in Paris at the end of next year. So I'm more than happy to take questions on that story in the Q&A, but I wanted to emphasize that what we're looking at now is something that's rather different from the Kyoto story, rather different from what was attempted in Copenhagen in 2009. And I think it's more pragmatic and more likely to be ambitious and dynamic and collaborative. In the past, we've seen ambitions which are modest, static and divisive, so surely better to be ambitious, dynamic and collaborative. Next slide, please. Let me then come, and I'll have to go through this rather rapidly, the role of energy systems. And next slide, please. I'll be strategic here rather than specific, but can come to more specificity in the questions. We have to recognize that the problem of growth, which we're talking about here, will be, and generating growth, will be a story that requires energy. If people have a right to development, we have to recognize, and surely they do, then we have to recognize that energy will be used in that development process. It should be as energy efficient as possible. Energy efficiency is absolutely fundamental. Most studies of what we have to do to reduce emissions indicate that something like half of what we have to do will be energy efficiency. It's the biggest single element. But we're going to have to break the link between energy and emissions. We can reduce the amount of energy we need for growth. That's energy efficiency, and we must. But we can't take energy out of economic activity. We can be more efficient in the energy, but we can't take it out. But one thing we can do is take the emissions out of energy. And we have to do both those things. More energy efficient, less energy to give a given amount of economic activity, but we have to take the emissions right out of energy during this century. We have to break the link between emissions and energy. So sometimes people talk about a right to emit. I think that's deeply mistaken. If emissions cause damage, nobody has a right to cause damage. What there is a right to development, and a right to development will involve the use of energy. So we have to be very clear about that when we think about our energy systems. Lots of aspects will be fundamental. I've already emphasized energy efficiency and the management of demand, not simply the quantity of demand, but when the demand occurs. And energy storage will be very important in this process. But the key thing is to use energy much more efficiently and break the link between energy and emissions. Next slide, please. So that story is going to have to be full of creativity, and it's going to be a story which will carry all kinds of benefits that come with it. If we break the link between energy and emissions, we'll have something which is a much cleaner way to live. That terrible damage brought by the PM 2.5 can be removed. As we reduce emissions, we can also remove those kinds of damages from air pollution, particularly, of course, from coal and diesel. And in so doing, we will make our energy much more secure, and we will build much more cohesive communities. Public transport will be a key part of this story. That's something which depends on communities coming together. Recycling and reusing requires communities. Combined heat and power requires communities. This is a story then of not only cleaner, quieter, safer, more energy secure, but more community-based. And at the same time, we can integrate that emissions reductions with the story of development and with the story of adaptation. Next slide, please. To make that change, we need strong policy. Most of the investment that's going to take place will be private sector investment, but it'll be in the context of policy that's set by governments. Governments at the center, governments in the states, governments in the cities. So we have to think of this process of investment and innovation largely through the actions of the private sector in the context of a policy framework and some parts of an infrastructure framework set by governments. Now, people invest, particularly in energy, over a period of 20, 30, 40 years. You have to have some confidence in government policy. It's not simply that the details of government policy have to be right. They do have to be right, and I'll say something about that in just a moment. But what I want to emphasize here is the sense of direction has to be clear and strong. And we've, in Europe, got ourselves into some difficulty over the last 5 or 6 years, where through the process of politics in relation to the recession, and in other ways too, some governments have been unclear on their signals. They've been unclear about how determined they are in going forward. And that kills investment. Government-induced policy risk is the biggest threat to investment around the world, wherever that government-induced policy risk comes from. So when I say that this is private sector investment driven by government policy, I want to say immediately after saying that that sense of direction has to be clear, strong, and credible if that private sector investment is going to come forward. That's why your legislation in Mexico is so important. And also why it's so important in Mexico that the commitment to the transition to low-carbon economy has carried through a change of presidency and the change of party. You have to have this commitment across the political spectrum if you're going to give the long-run confidence for the kind of private sector investment that's going to drive this story. Angel Gurria put it very well when, as Secretary General of the OECD, he gave a lecture at my own university, the London School of Economics, when he said we have to be crystal clear and stay clear that we're going to eliminate emissions from the combustion of fossil fuels by the second half of the century. Next slide, please. Some key elements of policy here. You'll forgive the economist in me for talking about market failures, but there's a whole collection of market failures at issue here. The first one is the biggest and most important, is that if you emit greenhouse gases, you are damaging the future of other people. If you do not restrict or charge for the emissions of greenhouse gases, you are subsidizing pollution. You're subsidizing damages to other people. You don't expect to be able to throw your garbage in the street. You expect to have to make arrangements for disposing of it in a responsible way. Well, you shouldn't claim the right to throw garbage into the atmosphere in just the same, it's the same argument. So the greenhouse gases are very important. If you have the second market failure is associated with innovation and R&D. If you have an idea, and we want people to have as many ideas as possible, if you have ideas on this front, those are ideas that are of value to other people. Your idea is not simply something which rewards you, it rewards other people. So that's something that has to be encouraged. Markets by themselves don't build networks. Public transport, broadband, electricity grids, recycling, they are things which are collective endeavors. They involve a lot of people, and they can't be put together by markets alone. They need legislation, they need government investment, and so on. We know that long-term capital markets don't necessarily handle risk very well. That's why development banks are so important. Nothing will play a central part in this story because development banks can bring down the cost of capital. They bring down the cost of capital by reducing risk because it's less risky if a development bank is involved. They bring down the cost of capital through the kind of equity base that they have. They can bring down the cost of capital by their convening power. They can be much better at putting syndicated loans and so on together. All kinds of ways in which development banks can bring down the cost of capital. And that's fundamental because renewables are mostly capital cost. If you halve the cost of capital, you can get close to halving the cost of renewables. There's a fundamental importance there, the long-term capital markets, and many other things as well. Information as to the efficiency of what you're consuming. And of course, we have to bear in mind the huge costs of damage to people through air pollution and ecosystems. So those are the kinds of policies that you have to bring to bear. if you're discussing accelerating this energy transition. We have to make the price which people pay to use hydrocarbons much higher, and we have to make the price that people get for producing hydrocarbons much lower. That's, if you're going to reduce the hydrocarbons, then the price that producers receive has to go down, and the price that people pay for hydrocarbons has to go up. It's called supply and demand, and it's obvious, right? But we have to be quite clear and honest about that process. And of course, the innovation story, infrastructure story, has to be very powerful. Next slide, please. I'm almost at the end of what I have to say, but let me just say a brief word about oil, gas, and renewables. We've all noticed in the last 6 months that the price of oil, just take that particular example, it's an important example, the price of oil has come down. That's a combination of reasons for the drop in the price of oil over the last 6 months. Increased output from the United States associated with unconventional oil in particular. Libya's production was a bit higher than people anticipated. You've had a long slowdown or recession in many parts of the world, which has reduced the demand for energy. And of course, energy efficiency measures have started to kick in. You're going to get these fluctuations in supply and demand. And we've seen big fluctuations in the price of oil over the last many years, the last many decades. But we've seen within those fluctuations a steady rise in the price of oil. As I say, around that long-term trend, a number of fluctuations. So my own view is that if people take a long-term view with a trend up in the price of oil, but with lots of fluctuations, it makes eminent sense to go for renewables where the marginal cost, the cost of using sun and wind is going to stay zero, and the capital costs are likely to continue coming on down. So I don't see the recent fall in the price of oil as actually changing the argument in any fundamental way, because we've got to look at the long-run trend. We also note that the reason the American oil has come on to, the US oil has come onto the market is because they were looking at prices around $100 a barrel, and their cost of production is around, many of them around $70 a barrel, so there's a $30 a barrel profit there. If the price comes down to 70 or even drops below 70 for an extended period, some of that supply will drop away. So some of the reason of the extra supply, which forced the drop in price, will go away. So I think it's reasonable to suppose that the floor price around $70 a barrel might be what we're looking at with fluctuations and trend. But if I knew what the price of oil was going to be, I would be very rich. And I don't know what the price of oil is going to be, and I'm not very rich. But we have to think long-term about this story of trend and fluctuation. And I think that if you do that, the case for renewables looks very powerful, whichever way you look at it. I do think we have to recognize that it's vital that we get out of coal as soon as we can. And if gas is used as a substitute for coal for a period of time, that will make sense. But we have to plan for beyond the gas. You have to plan now and be clear now that if that gas comes in 20 or 25 years from now, because of the emissions reductions we have to make, that's either going to have to be phased out or combined with carbon capture and storage. One of the conclusions of the Better Growth, Better Climate report was there should be no coal-fired power stations in rich countries from now on. So let me go now to my conclusions. Next slide, please. So I've told the story that we can overcome poverty and we can achieve sustainable development, but we have to act radically, we have to commit, we have to give long-term credible signals, but that it is possible and it's a much more attractive way to grow. Next slide, please. I've told this story as not only one that's feasible, but one that's extremely attractive. Cleaner, quieter, better, more community-based, stronger ecosystems, and so on. So we have a real option here, and it's a very attractive option, but time is not on our side. I've described this process of structural transformation, which is moving very quickly in the world. If we do not handle it well over this next 2 decades, we will lock in high carbon capital and infrastructure. Excuse me. So this story of opportunity, which I've emphasized, of exciting opportunity, attractive opportunity, is now. And we can use that opportunity or we can lose it because of this very fast structural transformation that's going on in the world. And if we do it badly over the next 2 decades, it will be very hard to unravel. So, but if we do it well, we'll lay the foundations for all the strong things we have to do after the next 2 decades. Next slide, please. So I believe that there's a growing understanding of that opportunity. I'm not so sure that there's a strong enough understanding of time and of the urgency and of the fact that if we lose that opportunity now, if we don't take it in the next 2 decades, we'll make life so much more difficult. That's another reason why what you're doing in Mexico is so important. First and foremost, it's important to you in Mexico, but there'll be many people looking at what you're doing. You're at the frontier of this story, and many people will look and many people will draw their own conclusions. So what you do matters, of course, first and foremost to you, but it does matter in the context of the world as a whole. I think that this is beginning to be understood in the international processes, but still the sense of urgency, the sense of scale is not yet strong enough, and we have to work to make that stronger. But I believe that if we do that, we do put those ideas together, we can rise to the 2 defining challenges of this century, overcoming poverty and managing climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And well, I think I have enough questions here to be for the next 4 hours. So some of them I think you already have answered, and then some I'm going to put together. But let me start asking, let me ask a question that comes from me. Let's assume in a hypothetical case of a country that basically has lots of trees. So basically, let's see, it's the lungs of the world. And it's a developing country. And one way of the perception of the population is that they can start cutting trees in order to improve their economy. And so then the developed world comes and says, well, wait a minute, you shouldn't be cutting trees because, you know, things are going to get worse, not only for us in the rest of the world, but also for you at the end of the day. But here you have a population that doesn't understand that, and of course, politicians have pressure to deliver. On the other hand, these countries that come to this hypothetical country have been using all these polluting energies in order to develop for 50, 60, 70 years. So how are you going to convince this population of this hypothetical country to accept reducing the speed of development because of these measures that are going to help everybody? Do you think that, for instance, you can come out with a tax around, the developed world that used X amount of, pollutant per capita for 50, 60 years in order to transfer that to the population of that other country, in order to have an incentive to basically stop cutting trees?
Thank you. I think there are two parts to that answer. One is to help develop a way of development, help create a way of development that is much more attractive than cutting the trees. So in other words, not to ask a country to slow down, to contribute to its attempts to find a way of doing things differently. Now, I mean, we can take the imaginary country to be Indonesia or Brazil or Congo, just to take examples from 3 different continents. And in many cases, the agriculture is done in a way which is very wasteful of land. Often from a history where land was rather plentiful, not always, but often from that history. So part of the challenge is to make agriculture, in this case, much more productive in terms of land and water. And there are many ways in which that can be done, and often agriculture is very wasteful. So find a way of increasing, in this case, agricultural productivity relative to water and land, which means that in order to increase agricultural production, in order to increase incomes, you don't have to cut the forest. I've been working in one village in North India for 40 years now. And in that village, it's now the case that something like 2/3, between 60% and 2/3 of the income now comes from outside agriculture. So included in that first part of the answer is not just agricultural productivity, it's opportunities outside agriculture. Here in Mexico, agriculture as a fraction of GDP is pretty small now. Yeah? So how did it become small? Because people became better off, partly through increasing productivity of agriculture, but more because increasing opportunities outside agriculture. So the first part of the answer is to work to create income opportunities through agriculture, but also outside agriculture, so that you don't have to cut down the trees in order to make a living. And help people near the forests garner some of the output that the forests themselves give and contribute to their standard of living. The second part of the answer is that, yes, I do think that rich countries have an obligation to help. But it's helping in finding a different way of development. So it's not thinking only about the forests. You have to think about the forests, and you have to try to find ways of generating income which give an incentive for those particular forests to look after them and not cut them. But at the same time, driving development forward, which will be a set of decisions made inside that country, your hypothetical country, but which outsiders have a duty to support, partly because they're rich countries and partly because of their history in terms of emissions.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to start putting together 3 or 4 questions at a time. There is one that I think you just, at the end of your presentation, what should be the role of development banks regarding climate change? I think you already answered that one when you were, but if you want to add something, basically, but let me...
Let me emphasize that. What is the role? Very important is the answer to that question, and we have to think of it about bringing down the cost of capital. I said that you're talking about something like 6 trillion a year around the world in infrastructure. The big majority of that will be outside the rich countries. Perhaps, I don't know, 4 trillion. That's, 4,000 billion. That has to be financed. And you can talk about aid of 100 billion or 200 billion. That's the small part of it. The big part of it is bringing down the cost of capital. And if you do, it's renewables which will be particular beneficiaries, because that's what they are. They use capital and they use the free wind and sunshine.
Okay, so from Carlos Villanueva from UNAM, which will be the role of nuclear energy to reach the goals of economic growth and sustainable development? So,
there are a number of ways to go low carbon. Carbon capture and storage is one, which would allow you to continue using hydrocarbons. Nuclear is one. I think renewables are the place with the strongest potential over the next century. But there's so much, and of course, sometimes people include hydro within renewables, sometimes they don't, but I would include hydro. So I think you need a broad spectrum. The change that we have to make is so big that I think it would be a mistake to rule out anything. And of course, nuclear provides base load, steady base load, and renewables don't. So I wouldn't rule out nuclear. It's the way we do nuclear, particularly in rich countries, is very expensive, so it may not be competitive. But the future of nuclear lies in China. China will build, in the next 15 or 20 years, probably around 100, 1 gigawatt, roughly, power stations. That experience, I think, will be key to the rest of the world understanding the potential for nuclear. For all of the energy systems that come into consideration, all of them, we have to think of the risks. If you look at deaths per kilowatt, the highest are coal and hydro. Nuclear quite low down the list, but there are different kinds of risks, and you have to look at all kinds of risks. So you have to think about the cost, you have to think about the type of electricity that's produced, you have to think about the risks, and any method you use, you have to think hard about all those things.
Thank you, Professor. Here, I'm going to try to put together several questions on this one. Basically is, what will be your opinion about the Mexican energy reform, but also with regards of the incentives, for instance, you know, to push for more hydrocarbons, you know, basically in our reform, as you know, we have the oil reform. So what is your opinion in the context of what you have been speaking, telling us today? What do you feel or what do you think about the Mexican reform?
I have to be very cautious in commenting on Mexican reform. I'm leaving Mexico in a few hours, so but I do want to come back. And of course, I'm not anywhere near as knowledgeable about it as all of you. But what I've learnt of it, you know, just prior to this visit and during this visit, I think that if you look at finance, energy reform, the climate change legislation and plans, it's a coherent story moving in a good direction. But as you develop your hydrocarbons, you have to think of what the world is going to look like 30, 40, 50 years from now. We know we're going to live with hydrocarbons for the next 2 or 3 decades. What we're thinking about is either using them safely, particularly through carbon capture and storage, or phasing them out. So any plans, as it were, have to be set. Any plans have to be set in that context. You should differentiate between hydrocarbons. I mean, coal is much the worst. Yeah? So, but nevertheless, you have to think about a world 30 or 40 years from now where we're using much less hydrocarbons or we're using carbon capture and storage.
All right, so I'm just asking if we have 3 more hours, or how long we have. No, basically because I'm having, this amount, and I guess they're bringing more of those, so I think we won't be able to go through all of them, but like I see some of them, like I was telling you, are, you can put them together into the blender. So here is one that is standalone. So the Mexican government has recently announced a contribution of $10 million to the Green Climate Fund. What is your view and expectations about the role that this fund can play?
I think the Green Climate Fund can play a significant but modest role. I tried to be very strong in what I had to say on the numbers. The world is going to have to finance $6 trillion or so a year of infrastructure investment, and it wants to do that well. So the key thing is the cost of long-term finance for that infrastructure. Maybe 3.5, 4 trillion will be in emerging markets and developing countries. That's, say, 4,000 billion. A green climate fund of 30 billion or 40 billion, which is optimistic at the moment, is small relative to that story. The big story, it's important and it should be there. It's significant. It indicates a commitment. But the bigger story is bringing down the cost of capital. The development banks of the world will be much, much more important than that.
What's your opinion about the recent compromises announced by the US and China last month?
The November the 12th joint announcement in Beijing was very important. It was very important because it showed the 2 biggest emitters sitting down and discussing together the magnitude of the problem, the urgency of the problem, and what they could do. It demonstrated awareness and a collaborative spirit, and it demonstrated confidence in the international process because they produced their plans something like 4 or 5 months before they were obligated to do so. So I think it was significant in all those senses. But as I said in my talk, if you put what Europe is doing and what United States and China is doing between now and 2030 together, it's a major step forward, but it still leaves us a long way short of what's necessary for 2 degrees.
Yeah, the next question, I think you already answered, but I think it's my opinion that should be emphasized again, because it says, don't you think that it's impossible to reach the low levels of CO2 emissions and grow at the same time?
I thought the whole lecture was about that.
I know. So therefore, I'm saying that I think you should basically repeat it, because I think this is the main question.
No, it's not impossible.
Usually.
Yes, it's possible. Yeah.
That's the answer, because I have several of those here. And you were talking exactly about that, so...
Well, if you want to think quietly about what I said, the slides will be available on Senair website, on London School of Economics website. The Calderon report is available. I think it's www.newclimateeconomy/report. So if you'd like to reflect more quietly, as it were, on the arguments, you can go there.
Exactly. Given that I had several of those questions, so I wanted you, to repeat that because I think it's important. That's one of the main questions. Can you grow at the same time? That's what you hear all the time. But here's another one.
It's absolutely crucial that we tackle that. That's because if it turns into a contest between growth on the one hand and climate responsibility on the other, climate responsibility will lose. But it's a false contest. It's a false horse race, and it's very important to show that it's false.
I'm going to read 2 more. How to assure that climate change mitigation does not become a hostage of global politics, as has been the case of the Millennium Development Goals?
you can't insure, but you can make it less likely. What I tried to do at the end of what I had to say, particularly around the idea of equitable access to sustainable development, was to build ways of understanding the issues, as I tried to describe, and build ways of collaborating through the UNFCCC that makes the politics more collaborative, that makes the politics part of striving together to build a bigger pie for ourselves and for the future. It's why the joint announcement, it wasn't a deal between the United States and China. It was a joint announcement. The title was very important. And paragraph 6 of that agreement, I hope I remember the number correctly, said explicitly that we recognize the major growth opportunities that lie in this alternative route. So you have to share and build the ideas that this is a much better and stronger way to grow. That diffuses the some aspects of antagonistic politics, and you have to behave in a way that recognizes the common interest.
And finally, what do you expect will be achieved in the COP20 in Lima and in Paris in 2015?
I hope in Lima, and whether I'm right or not, we'll discover within the next 10 days, will be an acceptance of the kind of process that I've described, that the notion of binding comes within the country, the notion of enforcement comes within the country. And,
Bless you.
Thank you. And that we have to build processes by which our plans are subject to transparent, open scrutiny, and we build processes by which we get together regularly to revise our ambitions upwards in the light of what other people are doing, in the light of experience and so on. Excuse me. I didn't realize that Mexico was so cold. I knew that London was cold. But that framework has to be constructed in Lima, and then you have to fill in the details in Paris.
Okay, so I think, yeah. You decide? No, basically, thank you very much for your patience and, of course, the presentations you have done. I think it's very, very important that you have been saying throughout your presentation to try to explain that you can grow and at the same time reduce emission. Because this is, I think, the most difficult part in convincing populations. I mean, because they say, but how am I going to grow if I need more electricity and I need more, all these different things that we have to copy from the developed world. And so it's difficult to convey to them that you can do, and politicians have to be the ones that have to be first convinced to be able to go and convince the populations. And so I think this effort that you are presenting, well, not only you, this climate change effort, it's very important because we are in the same moving spaceship. I mean, we are together. So if you have a small hole, like if you are in a small boat and you have a small hole, well, all the boat is going to go down with everybody in the boat. So basically, but it's important to continue pushing for this, because at the end of the day, like you have been explaining, it's not good for the human race. And so having said that, I would like, a big round of applause for Professor. And thank you very much for being with us, and thank you very much for all of you being with all of us. And I'm going to give you all these questions. There are some, emails, so maybe when you are in your travels in the plane, you can answer some. Thank you very much.